The morning Ella Norris found the north fence mended, she stood at the edge of her property for a long time without moving, her breath fogging in the cold November air, and felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in 3 years, the uneasy stirring of gratitude that she did not ask for and could not send back. She had not heard a horse. She had not heard a hammer. Whoever had done it was long gone by the time she walked out to check on her cattle at first light, and the post stood straight and true in the frozen ground, the wire stretched tight and clean, as though the fence had always been that way, and she had simply failed to notice. She stood there in her worn wool coat, her dark hair pulled back beneath a faded blue kerchief, the Oklahoma Territory wind pressing against her like a cold hand, and she told herself that it could have been anyone, a neighbor passing through, someone who owed her late husband a debt she did not know about. She told herself it was not Cornelius Hartwell, but she knew that it was. She had known him by reputation before she ever knew him by name. He ran a modest cattle operation about 4 miles east of her place, along the creek that fed both their properties. He was a quiet man, mid-30s, broad through the shoulders and lean through everything else, with steady brown eyes and a jaw that suggested he made up his mind slowly and did not change it often. He had come to her door the first winter after Thomas died, the winter of 1882, when the ice storms came early and stayed long, and the ground was too hard to do anything with, and he had taken off his hat and said, simply, that he had noticed she was running the place alone, and that he had some extra lumber if she needed to patch the barn. She had thanked him and told him she was managing fine. He had nodded, put his hat back on, and left without argument. He came back in the spring of that year before the second winter with an offer to help drive her cattle to the stockyards in Guthrie so she would not have to hire men she did not know. She had her own hands by then, 2 of them, young and eager if not always skilled, and she thanked him and told him she was managing fine. He nodded, put his hat on, left. The second winter was harder. One of her hands quit to follow a mining operation up in Colorado, and the other broke his wrist in a fall from the roof of the chicken coop. Cornelius Hartwell showed up at her door in December of 1883 with a wagon load of feed corn, because he had heard she was short. She stood in the doorway of her farmhouse with her youngest, me, balanced on her hip, and she looked at the wagon and she looked at him and she thanked him and told him she was managing fine. He had paused that time. He had looked at the corn in his wagon, and then he had looked at her with those steady, unhurried eyes, and she had thought for a moment that he was going to say something she would have to answer, but he had only nodded. He unloaded half the corn beside her barn, not all of it, just half, as though he were leaving the decision partially in her hands, and he drove away without asking for payment or thanks. She told herself she was angry about it. She used the corn. Every last kernel of it. The third winter, 1884, she had not seen him at all. Not at the door, not at the church socials she occasionally attended, not at the general store in Clearwater. She told herself she was relieved. She told herself that Thomas had been gone 3 years and that the grief had settled into something manageable, like a stone she carried in her pocket, always there, its weight familiar but no longer capable of stopping her in her tracks. She told herself she did not need anyone's corn or lumber or charity, and that Cornelius Hartwell had finally understood that and moved on to someone more appreciative. And then she walked out to check her fence on a cold November morning and found every broken post mended and every sagging wire pulled straight. No note, no wagon tracks that stayed long enough to identify, nothing to confront, nothing to refuse, nothing to return. She stood there and looked at that fence for a long time. Then she walked back to the house, lit the stove, and started breakfast for her 2 children, and she did not think about it again until she was lying in the dark that night, listening to the wind come down off the plains, and found that she could not stop thinking about it at all. Ella had married Thomas Norris when she was 22 years old and he was 28, in the spring of 1879, when the territory was still wild and the nearest town was half a day's ride, and the land felt like something out of a dream that had not yet decided whether it would be a good one or a bad one. Thomas was a good man, steady and funny, and not much for poetry but capable, on a clear evening, of making her laugh until her ribs ached. He had died of a fever in the fall of 1881, when Mee was barely 2 years old and their son, Jacob, was 4, and it had happened so fast that she had not had time to prepare herself. 3 days from the first symptom to the last breath. She had held his hand at the end, and the thing that struck her most, aside from the grief that hit her like a wall of water, was how ordinary the room looked. The same curtains, the same kerosene lamp, the same worn quilt she had made the winter before, everything exactly the same and everything entirely different. She had not let herself fall apart. She had a farm and 2 small children, and she could not afford to fall apart, so she did not. She got up every morning and fed the animals and mended the fences, when she could, and cooked the meals and read to Jacob and me by lamplight at night. And she told herself that pride was not a sin if it kept you from becoming a burden, and she believed it. She believed it so thoroughly that she had stopped being able to tell the difference between genuine strength and the fear of needing someone and being failed. It was her closest neighbor, Dora Finch, who said it plainly, one afternoon over coffee that fall. Dora was a round-faced, direct woman who ran a small mercantile with her husband, and she did not believe in dancing around the truth. "You know Cornelius Hartwell mended your north fence," Dora said, wrapping her hands around her cup. Ella did not look up from the biscuit dough she was turning on the board. "I suspected. He was out there before sunrise. My Frank saw him ride past. Then Frank can mind his own business." Dora made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. "Ella, that man has been trying to help you for 3 years, and you've been turning him away like he's coming to collect a debt." "He doesn't need to be helping me. Maybe he wants to. Wanting to is not the same as being needed." "No," Dora agreed, "but it might be the same as caring." Ella pressed her knuckles into the dough harder than was strictly necessary. "Thomas has been gone 3 years, Dora, not 30. That is not what I'm talking about, and you know it." Ella did know it. That was the problem. She could feel the conversation turning toward something she was not ready to look at directly, the way you did not look directly at the sun, not because it was not there, but because looking at it straight on changed something in you. She shaped the biscuits with more precision than they required and said nothing further, and Dora let the subject drop, which was one of the things Ella liked best about her. But the words sat with her for days afterward, like stones dropped in still water, the ripples moving outward whether she wanted them to or not. She did not go looking for Cornelius Hartwell. That was not something she would have done, because she was not built for going toward things that frightened her. She was built for standing her ground in the face of them, which was a different skill entirely. But she kept finding him at the edges of her days. In church on Sunday, across the aisle, hat in his lap, the back of his neck brown from the sun. At the Clearwater General Store one Saturday in December, when she was buying lamp oil and he was buying nails, and they stood beside each other at the counter, and she said good morning, and he said good morning, and there was a silence between them that was somehow thicker than most silences she had experienced. "The fence looks good," she said finally, because she was not entirely capable of dishonesty, even when dishonesty would have been more comfortable. He looked at her. Those steady brown eyes, no flicker of smugness in them, no waiting for credit. "Glad it's holding," he said. "I didn't ask you to do that." "No," he agreed. "I was going to get to it myself." "I know." She looked at him for a moment and tried to find something in his face to push against some suggestion of pity or superiority, or the particular brand of helpful that was really about the helper feeling useful, but she could not find it. He simply looked back at her, unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world and no particular agenda about what she decided to do with it. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and paid for his nails and held the door for her on the way out, and that was all. She rode home through the cold afternoon and tried to decide how she felt about it, and the closest she could come was that she felt the way you felt when you had been bracing against a wind that suddenly died, still leaning forward, but with nothing to push against. She invited him to supper on a Thursday night in January of 1885. She spent the better part of 2 days telling herself it was a purely practical decision, because her children needed to know the neighbors, and Jacob was 7 now and wanted to ask someone other than his mother about cattle, and it was simply the hospitable thing to do. She cooked a proper meal, roasted chicken and sweet potatoes and corn bread, and a dried apple pie that she made twice because the first one looked wrong to her. And she put on the blue dress she had not worn since before Thomas died. And then she felt foolish about the dress and changed back into her everyday one. And then she felt more foolish about the changing and put the blue dress back on. Cornelius arrived exactly when she had told him, which was 6 o'clock, and he knocked at the door with his hat already in his hands. He had washed up and wore a clean shirt, dark blue cotton, and he had combed his hair. He looked like what he was, a working man who had made a real effort for a real occasion, and something about the realness of that, the lack of performance in it, made her throat feel strangely tight. Jacob was in the doorway in approximately 2 seconds, staring up at him with open curiosity. "Are you the man who fixed our fence?" "Jacob," Ella said. Cornelius crouched down to the boy's level without hesitation, the way some men could and some men absolutely could not. "I am," he said. "You're Jacob." "Mama said she was going to fix it herself." "She likely would have." "Then why did you?" Cornelius thought about that with apparent seriousness. "Because it needed doing and I had the tools," he said. "Sometimes that's enough reason." Jacob considered this and apparently found it satisfactory, because he stepped back and said, "We're having chicken." "I can already smell it," Cornelius said, straightening up, and he looked at Ella over the boy's head with something in his eyes that was quiet and warm and did not demand anything from her, and she turned quickly back to the stove because she needed a moment she did not want him to witness. Mee was shyer than her brother, dark-eyed and watchful, and she spent the first half of supper studying Cornelius from the far end of the table, as though he were a problem she was working through. He did not try to win her over, which Ella noticed and appreciated. He talked to Jacob about cattle and horses and did not talk down to the boy, treating his questions with the same thoughtfulness he seemed to bring to everything. And he spoke to Ella about the territory and the winter and the land. And the conversation moved the way good conversation moved, not too fast, not forced, finding its own level. By the time Ella brought out the pie, Mee had moved her chair approximately 6 inches closer to Cornelius, without seeming to notice that she had done it. He helped clear the table without being asked and without making a performance of it, and when the children were sent to bed and the kitchen was quiet, Ella poured 2 cups of coffee and they sat at the table, and the silence between them was different from the one at the general store. That one had been a silence with edges. This one was soft. "You have a good place here," Cornelius said. "Thomas built well." It was the first time anyone had said his name in her house in a long time, and she found that it did not hurt the way she expected it to. It simply sounded like what it was, the name of a man she had loved, who had been here and was not here anymore. "He did," she said. "I've tried to keep it." "You've done more than keep it. That kitchen garden is the best tended one in this county and you know it." She looked at him. "How would you know what my kitchen garden looks like?" He had the grace to look momentarily caught. "I ride past on the creek road sometimes." "You ride past and look at my garden." "I ride past and notice things," he said without apparent embarrassment. "It's a good garden. You should be proud of it." She should have felt unsettled by that, and she did not. That was the thing that surprised her most. She should have felt watched, examined, catalogued, and instead she felt seen in some way that was entirely distinct from all of those. The way you felt when someone recognized something you had worked hard at and was not asking you for anything in return for the recognition. She asked him about his own operation, and he told her straightforwardly, without either false modesty or boasting, about the 120 head he was running, and the 2 hands he employed year-round, and the small house he had built himself the first year in the territory, which he said was better than a tent but not by an enormous margin. He said this without self-pity and with a brief smile that changed the look of his whole face, and she found herself watching that smile with more attention than she strictly needed to. He left at 8:30, which was the right time to leave. At the door he put his hat on and said, "Thank you for supper, Mrs. Norris. It was the best meal I've sat down to in a long time." "Ella," she said, because she had been thinking it for the last 2 hours and it came out before she decided to say it. He looked at her. "Ella," he said, and there was nothing remarkable about the way he said it, just her name, just those 2 syllables, but she felt it in her chest the way you felt a single clear note of music in a quiet room. "Good night, Cornelius," she said. "Good night." She watched him ride out through the cold dark, and then she stood at the window for a while longer than was necessary. And then she turned the lamp down and went to check on her children, and she lay awake for a very long time listening to the silence of the house and thinking about what it sounded like to have someone else's voice in it. The next several weeks were ordinary, and yet they were not ordinary, because something had shifted in the way she moved through her days, a kind of heightened awareness, as though the air itself were slightly more present than it had been. She noticed the cold differently. She noticed the color of the grass coming up brown through the snow at the edge of the creek, and the way the winter sky over the territory was a particular shade of pale blue in the afternoons that she had never quite looked at before. She saw Cornelius at church 3 Sundays running, and they spoke briefly. Just the news of neighbors old Harlan Betts had sold his Eastern 40 to a family coming up from Texas. The Clearwater Bridge was icing badly, and the county was going to need to address it. The pastor's wife had finally had her baby, and it was a healthy boy. Small talk, the currency of rural life. But within the small talk there was a current, the way there was a current beneath the frozen surface of the creek, invisible from above but present and moving, if you knew to look. Dora Finch noticed, because Dora noticed everything, and she said nothing, which was her way of saying everything. In February, during a brief warm spell that made the world smell of mud and creek water and thawed things, Cornelius rode over to ask if he could borrow her team for a day, because one of his horses had thrown a shoe, and the blacksmith in Clearwater was backed up. It was a legitimate request, the kind neighbors made of each other constantly, and she said yes and made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table again, this time in the afternoon light, and there was a comfortable quality to it that she recognized as dangerous because it felt so much like something she wanted. "Jacob's been asking me when you're coming to supper again," she said, and then immediately felt the openness of what she had said and looked down at her coffee. "Has he?" Cornelius said. He was quiet for a moment. "What have you been telling him? That it depends on whether I have time to cook a proper meal." "That seems fair." She looked up. He was looking at her steadily, with that particular quality of attention she had come to recognize as simply how he was unhurried, undemanding, present. "I could cook Saturday," she said. His smile came slowly, like something that had been waiting a long time for permission. "I'll be here at 6, he said. That second supper was easier and harder all at once. Easier because the children knew him now, and Jacob spent the whole meal trying to convince him that a boy of 7 was perfectly capable of riding alone to Clearwater, and Cornelius engaged with this argument with complete seriousness, which made Jacob feel respected and made Ella feel warm in a way she did not examine. Harder because when their hands brushed over the bread basket, she felt it all the way up her arm and had to set her fork down for a moment and pretend to be looking at something outside the window. Me fell asleep at the table before the pie was served, which was unprecedented, and Cornelius lifted her without being asked and carried her to her room with such matter-of-fact gentleness that Ella stood in the doorway and watched him settle the child under her quilt and felt the world do something it had not done in a long time. It did not shift or crack or fall away. It simply expanded quietly, like a room you discover is larger than you thought. She was washing dishes after he helped the children to bed, and he was drying them, which she had not asked him to do, and the kitchen was close and warm and smelled of coffee and apple pie, and she said, without fully planning to say it, "Thomas would have liked you." There was a brief pause. Cornelius set down the cup he was drying. That's a generous thing to say. It's a true thing. She kept washing. He was a good judge of character. Not much for second chances if he thought a man wasn't straight, but if he thought you were, he was loyal as a dog. She paused. He would have found your fence mending infuriating, but he would have liked you for it anyway. Would he have let me do it? Cornelius asked, and there was something in the question that she understood was about more than the fence. She thought about that. She turned it over carefully, the way you turned a stone to look at the underside, not because you expected something to be hiding there, but because the turning itself was how you came to know a thing. I don't know, she said honestly. He was stubborn about asking for help too. We were well matched that way. Stubborn runs in the property, does it? She almost laughed and then did laugh. And it came out quiet and genuine and a little surprised, the way laughter did when you had not expected it. And she heard him make a low sound that was his version of the same thing, and they finished the dishes in comfortable quiet, and she thought about Thomas and did not feel guilty for being here, which was its own kind of mercy. He began to come by more regularly after that, but always with a practical reason attached. He had brought Jacob a leather cord for a slingshot the boy had been trying to make. He had an extra bag of oats that would go bad before he could use it. He wanted to ask her opinion on which stretch of the creek she had found to be most reliable for summer water, because he was thinking about shifting his grazing rotation. The practical reasons were transparent and genuine at once. He was not manufacturing pretexts exactly, but he was also not pretending that the pretexts were the point. She did not pretend either. She made coffee. She set out whatever she had that was worth setting out. She sat across from him and learned him the way you learned a landscape. Gradually, through all seasons and lights, until you knew which features were constant and which changed and which could surprise you. She learned that he had come to the territory from Kentucky in 1878, the same year as her, though they had come separately and had not met until after Thomas died. She learned that he had a sister in Lexington he wrote to every month without fail, and that she sent him books which he read slowly and thought about seriously, and that he had opinions about things. She had not expected him to have opinions about the treatment of the Cherokee and Cheyenne who had been pushed from the land that was now the territory, which he spoke about with a flatness that was not indifference but the opposite of it, the kind of flatness that covered something you felt too deeply to make loud. He said once, over coffee in late March, that the land they were all farming and ranching had been promised to the nations and then taken, and that he thought about that when he drove in his fence posts, and he did not know what to do with it except to know it and not pretend it was otherwise. She respected that more than she would have been able to articulate. She told him things in return. She told him about growing up in Missouri and about her father's farm, and about the year the crops failed and her father's silence in the months that followed. A silence that taught her early that men who could not ask for help sometimes lost the most. She told him about meeting Thomas at a church social and knowing in the way you sometimes just knew. She told him about the fever and about the 3 days at the end, and she told it plainly, without performing the grief, because it was hers and it did not need an audience. He listened the way he did everything, without rushing to fill the silence, without offering reassurance she had not asked for. He just listened, and when she was done he said, he was lucky to have you with him at the end, and she had to look out the window for a moment. Spring came to the Oklahoma territory the way it always did, fast and extravagant after the long gray winter, the land going from bare brown to green in what seemed like days, the creek running high and cold and noisy, the wildflowers coming up along the south-facing slopes in waves of blue and yellow. Ella's kitchen garden went in on the last week of March, when the soil was still cold but workable, and she was on her knees in the dirt one afternoon when she heard a horse and looked up to find Cornelius dismounting at her fence. "I brought seed potatoes," he said, holding up a burlap sack. "My sister sends them from Kentucky every year, better than what you can buy in town." She sat back on her heels and looked at him with the sun in her face. He was backlit against the bright spring sky, and she thought, with a clarity that was almost startling, that he was a good-looking man. She had registered this before in an abstract way but had not allowed herself to consider it directly, and now she did, and it was simply true. The broad shoulders and the lean jaw and the way he stood, feet slightly apart, comfortable in his own weight, the kind of ease that came from knowing exactly what you were and not requiring anything to be different. "You could have sent the potatoes with someone," she said. "I could have," he agreed, without the slightest indication of embarrassment. He opened the gate and came into the garden and crouched down to look at what she was doing, and she noticed that he did not ask permission, not because he was presumptuous but because they had come, quietly and without announcement, to the point where he did not need to. She had let him in. Not all the way, not yet, but past the gate, past the first line of resistance, and they both knew it. "Show me where you want them," he said. She showed him, and they worked in the garden together through the warm afternoon. And Jacob came home from school, such as school was, a one-room building with a teacher who came 3 days a week, and dropped his books on the porch and ran directly to Cornelius to tell him about something that had happened at the creek that morning involving a catfish and a failed attempt at catching it with a rope. Me followed more slowly, and by the end of the afternoon she had posted herself approximately 12 inches from Cornelius's left knee and was handing him potatoes from the bag with great seriousness of purpose. Ella stood up at one point and pressed her hand to her lower back and watched the three of them, the man and her 2 children, the late afternoon light laying itself across the newly turned earth, and felt something happen in her chest that she had been fighting against for months. Not grief, not longing, not the complicated ache of loss. Something forward-facing, something that wanted. She turned back to the garden before anyone could see her face. He stayed for supper, which was not planned but was also not a surprise, and afterward he and Jacob sat on the porch steps while the light faded, and the stars came up one by one and talked about horses and cattle and the creek, and Ella stood just inside the screen door and listened to the sound of her son's voice going high and animated and Cornelius's voice underneath it, low and steady, the way a creek ran underneath wind, always there regardless of what moved above it. Later, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, they sat on the porch together in the dark, and she said, without leading up to it, "I have been afraid." He did not ask of what. He seemed to know, or to know that she would tell him what she meant if she wanted to. "After Thomas," she said, "I think I decided that needing someone was the same as risking them. If you need someone and they leave or are taken, then the need itself becomes the injury." She looked at the dark shape of the tree line against the sky. "I thought being self-sufficient was the same thing as being safe." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And now? Now I think I was confusing 2 different things." She paused, "But I'm still afraid." "That seems honest," he said. "You're not going to tell me I don't need to be." "No," he said. "Fear of losing people you love is reasonable. I'd be suspicious of anyone who didn't have it." She looked at him. The word he had used had not been accidental, and they both knew it, sitting between them in the warm dark like a held breath. "Cornelius," she said. "Ella," he said in the same tone, and she heard in it everything that had not been said over the past months. The fence in the cold morning, and the corn unloaded beside her barn, and the supper and the potatoes in the garden, and every cup of coffee, and every hour of careful, patient, unhurried presence. She reached out in the dark and put her hand over his where it rested on the porch railing. His hand turned under hers and held it, and they sat like that in the spring dark, listening to the creek running high with snowmelt and the first chorus of frogs beginning somewhere in the low ground. And she thought that this was the furthest she had come from the morning of Thomas's death, and that the distance felt right. He did not kiss her that night, and she was glad of it, because it would have been too fast, too much. A door swung all the way open when she was only ready for it to be standing ajar. Instead, he said good night and rode home, and she watched the lantern of his horse bob away across the dark land, and felt that she had taken a step she could not untake, and that this was not the disaster she had spent 3 years preparing herself against. The following weeks had the quality of something new and green, tender, and not quite hardy yet, needing sun but not too much. They were careful with each other. He came by for practical reasons that were no longer only practical, and she made coffee and set out food and they talked, and sometimes the children were there and sometimes they were not. And there was a particular Tuesday evening in May when Jacob was at a school friend's house and me was asleep early from a full day of playing in the creek. And they sat at the kitchen table and the lamp was low, and she looked across at him and thought, simply and without complication, that she was happy. It had been so long since she had thought that, without a note of guilt appended to it, that the cleanliness of it startled her. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She considered being evasive and decided against it. "That I'm happy," she said, "right now, at this table." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Good," and the word carried everything it needed to carry. In June, at the county fair in Clearwater, a modest affair involving livestock judging and a baking competition, and a fiddle band that played with more enthusiasm than precision. They walked together in a way that required no explanation but generated, as she was aware, a certain amount of commentary among the neighbors. She had expected this to bother her, and found that it did not quite. Dora caught her eye across the crowd and raised her eyebrows, and Ella gave her the small, private smile of someone who did not intend to be embarrassed about anything. Cornelius won second place in the cattle judging, which he accepted with the same equanimity he brought to everything, and she won first in the pie competition, which she claimed to have expected, and he looked at her sideways when she said it, and she felt the laugh in his eyes before it reached his face. They walked by the creek at the edge of the fairground as the afternoon got long and golden, and the children were occupied at the game stalls and out of sight, and he stopped walking and she stopped because he did, and he turned to look at her in the long summer light. "I'd like to ask you something," he said. She thought she knew what it was. She had been knowing for some time what it would be, the way you knew a storm was coming when the light changed, not yet but certain. "All right," she said. "I am not a man who is easy with long speeches," he said. "You know that. I do. And I don't want to press you into something you're not ready for, because I've spent the last 3 years watching you do things your own way and it suits you and I respect it." "But," she said, because there was clearly a but. "But I love you," he said. "I have loved you for a long time, since before I mended that fence, if I'm being honest, which I generally try to be." He paused. "I'm not asking you to decide anything right now. I'm just telling you, so you know where I stand." The creek ran beside them over its smooth stones. Somewhere behind them, the fiddle music from the fair drifted on the warm air. She looked at him and thought about the fence post standing straight in the frozen ground, and the corn beside the barn, and the potatoes in her kitchen garden, and his voice on the porch talking to her son in the dark, and the way he had carried me to bed without being asked, and had said Thomas's name as though it were a name that belonged in her house. "I love you too," she said. "I have been trying not to for a while, but I do." Something moved across his face, relief, she thought, and something quieter beneath it, the look of a man who had been patient for a long time and had not been entirely certain the patience would pay off. He reached up and tucked a strand of her hair back from her face, carefully, as though she were something he did not want to startle, and she leaned into his hand slightly without meaning to. And then he kissed her, gently and with great deliberateness, in the long summer light at the edge of the creek, and it was nothing like the first time she had been kissed, which was what made it exactly right. They were not immediately transformed into people who had no complications. She was still Ella Norris, stubborn and proud and entirely accustomed to making all her own decisions, and he was still a man who communicated in actions more fluently than words, and who had his own well-established way of doing things. There were moments in the summer that followed that were not entirely smooth, a disagreement about whether she should sell the eastern 40 of her property to the Texas family that had taken Harlan Betts's land, which she wanted to do and he thought was premature, and which she did anyway because it was her land and he knew enough not to make a large issue of it, though she also acknowledged privately that his concern about the water rights was not without merit. There were also moments that were very smooth indeed. Long evenings on the porch when they sat close, and the conversation moved wherever it wanted to go. Afternoons when he came over and worked beside her, and there was no need to talk. The Sunday morning in July when she arrived at church, and he was already there, and he had saved her a seat, and the small, ordinary fact of that someone saving her a seat made her stop in the doorway for just a beat. In August, he asked her to marry him. He did it at her kitchen table, which she appreciated, because it meant he knew her well enough to know she would want to be on her own ground for it. He had, she noticed, brought a sprig of wild blue larkspur from somewhere, probably the creek bank, and laid it on the table between them, which was the closest thing to a gesture of poetry she had seen him make, and she thought she liked him more for it being slightly awkward, the flower slightly wilted, a man who was not accustomed to grand gestures making one anyway because she was worth the attempt. "I know you built this place yourself, and I'm not asking you to give it up," he said. "I thought we might talk about what it would look like, both operations together." He paused. "But first I need to know if you'd be willing." She looked at the wilted flower. She looked at him. She thought about everything that the word willing contained. Willing meant choosing, not resigning. Willing meant opening the door all the way, not leaving it standing ajar. Willing meant deciding that the risk of losing was not greater than the possibility of having. "Yes," she said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand over and held on, and it was nothing like the first time she had held someone's hand at a kitchen table, which was also what made it right. They told the children that evening after supper. Jacob received the information with a complicated expression that moved through surprise, calculation, and something that looked like pleasure, and then said, "Does that mean Cornelius is going to live here?" with such transparent hope that Ella had to look away to preserve her composure. "We'll be living together, yes," Cornelius said, crouching to the boy's level as he had from the very first evening. "What do you think about that?" Jacob thought about it with the visible seriousness he brought to most things. "Can we build a bigger barn?" "Probably," Cornelius said. "All right then," Jacob said, as though this were the deciding factor, and went back to his supper. Mee had been watching from her chair with those dark, watchful eyes, and she said nothing until Cornelius looked at her. And then she climbed down from her chair, walked to him, and put her small arms around his neck, and he held her for a moment with his eyes closed, and Ella looked at the window because the evening light outside was not doing anything remarkable, but she needed somewhere to look that was not her daughter's face or the man holding her. They were married in September of 1885 at the small Clearwater church, on a Saturday when the territory was in full autumn color, and the air had that particular dry gold quality of early fall. Dora Finch cried, which surprised no one. The pastor's wife brought the baby she had been carrying through all of this and stood in the back and looked satisfied, as though she had been rooting for this outcome for some time. Old Harlan Betts, who had not actually left the area despite selling his land, sat in the second row and told anyone who would listen that he had seen it coming since the second winter. Ella wore a dress she had made herself, ivory cotton with small blue flowers embroidered at the cuffs and collar, which she had sewn in the evenings over the past month while the children slept, and she stood at the front of the church and looked at Cornelius, who was wearing a proper suit jacket that fit him imperfectly in the shoulders, because he was not a man built for jacket shoulders, and she thought that she would remember the way he looked at her for the rest of her life. Not with the reverence of a man who had put her on a pedestal. She would not have wanted that, but with the specific look of a person who saw you whole and was choosing you completely. The vows were the simple ones, the traditional ones, the words that had been said by every couple who had ever stood in this particular alignment. She said them and meant them in a way that was different from the first time she had said them, not lesser but fuller. The way a river ran fuller after rain, the same river, carrying more. They moved their operations together over the course of that fall. Cornelius's cattle came to her larger grazing land, and his 2 hands came with them. Emilio, who was 23 and from Texas, and could rope anything from a calf to a small building, and a quiet man named Birch who spoke rarely and worked constantly, and seemed to find social situations more manageable if he had a tool in his hand. Ella's farm absorbed the additional labor and the additional hands with a kind of organic ease, as though it had been sized for this all along, and she simply had not known it. Cornelius's house on the creek property sat empty through that first winter, and he and Ella discussed what to do with it at length, because she was a person who wanted to think through decisions thoroughly, and he was a person who had opinions but was willing to have them changed by good argument. They finally decided to let it to a young family named Kramer who had come up from Texas the previous spring, and had been living in circumstances that Ella, upon visiting them, described to Cornelius as unacceptable, by which she meant she had come home, and told him they needed to offer the house at a very reasonable rent, and he had agreed before she finished the sentence. The first winter of their marriage was full. That was the word Ella kept coming back to, full, the way a good season was full, crowded with work and warmth and the business of living. There was the routine of a shared life, which required adjustments she had not anticipated. She was accustomed to making every decision in the household without consultation, and he was accustomed to making every decision in his own household without consultation. And there were moments of rubbing in the early months, small frictions about how the wood was stacked, and who spoke to the hands about which tasks, and whether the kitchen window should be left open in the mornings. Which sounds foolish stated plainly, but is not foolish at all when you have been alone for a long time, and your habits have become the shape of your solitude. They navigated these with imperfect but genuine good will. He learned that she needed to know things in advance, not be surprised by decisions, even small ones. She learned that he had a way of going silent when he was troubled that was not shutting her out, but rather how he worked through things, and that the right response was not to pry, but to leave a door open and wait. They argued sometimes, productively and occasionally at volume, because she was not a quiet woman when she had a strong opinion, and he was not a man who entirely folded in argument, and the arguments generally ended with both of them having thought more carefully about the matter than either had at the start. The children adapted faster than she had expected. Jacob attached himself to Cornelius with the frank devotion of a boy who had been missing a male presence and was too young to be subtle about it. And Cornelius received this with the same unhurried patience he brought to everything, teaching the boy what he knew about cattle and horses and the land with a thoroughness that surprised her. Me took longer and was quieter about it, but equally complete when it happened, which was one morning in December when Ella came into the kitchen and found me sitting on Cornelius's knee while he read to her from one of the books his sister had sent, his voice slow and steady around the words, and me entirely relaxed against him with her small dark head against his chest. There was also, that first winter, the matter of Ella's independence, which did not disappear simply because she had married. She continued to run the farm with a directness that occasionally surprised the hands who were new to working alongside a woman who gave orders clearly and expected them followed. Cornelius backed her in every instance, which she had been watching for, and which she found he did naturally and without discussion, as though it had never occurred to him to do otherwise. He said once, when she asked him about it, "You know this land better than I do. Why would I tell my men differently?" She found this more attractive than she would have previously thought it possible to find a practical attitude toward work organization. Spring came again, the second spring of their marriage, and with it the kitchen garden going back in, this time with both of them working it on a Saturday morning while the children ran in the new grass, and she looked at him across the turned earth and felt the thing she had felt the previous spring standing up from her knees, that forward-facing want, except that now it was not want exactly, it was possession, not of him but of this life. This particular morning, with the dirt on both their hands and the sound of her children running, and the tree lined green with new leaves, and the creek running high, and the sky that particular Oklahoma spring blue. "What are you thinking?" He asked because he had learned over the past months to ask her this, and because she had learned that telling him the truth of it was the right choice. "That I was wrong about the fence," she said. He looked up from the row he was turning. "The fence. 3 years ago, when you mended it." She smoothed the earth over a row of seeds with her palm. "I thought accepting help was the same as admitting defeat. I thought needing anyone was weakness." She paused. "I was wrong about the definition of strength." He considered this for a moment. "You figured it out," he said. "You were patient enough to let me." "I had some self-interest in that," he said, and the brief smile came across his face, the one that changed the whole look of it. "Cornelius." "Ella, come here," she said. He crossed the garden row, and she stood up and kissed him in the middle of the dirt with the spring light on both of them. And he put his hands on her face the way he had learned she liked, and held her there a moment longer than necessary. And she thought that this was what she had been protecting herself from all those years, not the pain, which had already found her regardless, but this, the softness of being known, the undefended heart. In the fall of 1886, a little over a year into their marriage, she told him she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen in the morning over coffee, the same way she told him most of the things that mattered, and he was quiet for a moment in the way that was not absence but depth. And then he set down his cup and came around the table and held her, not saying anything, just held her. And she put her head against his shoulder and felt the solidity of him, and thought that she had been afraid for so long, and that the fear was not entirely gone, but it had company now. And company changed the shape of things. Her pregnancy that winter was manageable, if not easy. She was 30 years old, which was not old but was not the youngest, and she was accustomed to hard work and did not stop, though Cornelius employed what she came to think of as his most effective strategy with her, which was simply being present and available for any task without making an issue of whether she needed him. She could not fault this method because she had no grounds to object to something that was never framed as objection. Jacob, at 9, received the news of the coming baby with the gravity of someone who had been given an important commission. Me, at 7, became immediately invested in the question of the name, which she raised at every mealtime with fresh angles of approach. The baby was born in June of 1887, on a morning when the land was warm and the creek was low from a dry spell, and the light came through the bedroom window in long gold bars. Dora Finch was there, because Ella had trusted Dora with her secrets long enough to trust her with this, and the doctor came from Clearwater and arrived only slightly after the fact, which was more or less how births in the territory went. It was a boy, healthy and loud, with Ella's dark hair and Cornelius's jaw, and when Cornelius was allowed in and he held his son for the first time, he looked at the child with the particular expression of a man confronting something larger than he had prepared himself for. And Ella watched his face from the pillow and loved him with an intensity that felt new even now. They named him Thomas William Hartwell. Thomas for her first husband, because the name deserved to continue, and because Cornelius had agreed without hesitation when she suggested it, which was, she thought, one of the truest things he had ever done. William for Cornelius's father. Thomas William was, from his first weeks, a vigorous and opinionated personality. Jacob was devoted to him from the beginning, carrying him around with the pride of a boy who had been given a purpose. Me appointed herself head of the baby's education and began teaching him the alphabet at approximately 3 weeks of age, which was unnecessary but endearing. The house was louder than it had ever been, and Ella sometimes stood in the middle of it and breathed it in, the noise and the warmth and the smell of a full house, and felt, with a completeness she had not known she was waiting for, that she was home. The following year brought its ordinary trials and its ordinary joys. The cattle operation expanded, and a good year at the stockyards allowed them to build the bigger barn that Jacob had requested in his first negotiation with Cornelius about the marriage, which Jacob received as a promise fulfilled, and which made him, if possible, even more devoted to his stepfather. The Kramer family on the east property had a second child and fixed up Cornelius's old house considerably, and the two families became close in the way that neighbors in the territory became close when they chose at dinners exchanged, labor shared, the quiet, reliable architecture of community. Ella's relationship with her land settled into something that felt more truly hers because she had chosen not to lose it, not through stubbornness but through will. There was a difference, and she had eventually learned what it was. She still ran the kitchen garden with the intensity the county had come to expect of her, and she still had strong opinions about water rights and grazing rotation, and she still, in moments of stress or depletion, could feel the ghost of that old reflex to shut the door and manage alone. But she had a different reflex now too, the one that turned toward him rather than away, and it was becoming the stronger one. In the evenings, after the children were in bed, and as the years passed there were 3 children in bed, and then 4, because me arrived in 1889 having somehow become 16 before anyone was quite prepared for it, and the baby Harriet came that same year, small and fierce and dark-eyed like her mother Ella, and Cornelius sat on the porch or at the kitchen table or by the fire, depending on the season, and talked or read or sat in the quiet that was not empty but was the opposite of empty. And she thought sometimes about the version of herself who had stood at the north fence in the November cold and looked at the mended posts and told herself it could have been anyone. She knew now what she had known then and had not been willing to act on. It could not have been anyone. It had always been him. One evening in late autumn of 1890, when the air had the particular sharpness that preceded the first frost, and the children were all in bed, and the house was quiet, Ella brought out the tin box she kept on the highest kitchen shelf, the one that held the few letters from Thomas. He had not been much of a letter writer, but he had written to her twice when he was away buying cattle the year before Jacob was born, and she had kept the letters. She set the box on the table and did not open it but sat looking at it for a moment, and Cornelius came and sat across from her and did not ask what she was doing. "I was thinking about how grief changes shape," she said. He waited. "In the beginning it was everything. It was the air in the house and the color of the light. And then it shrank down to something you could carry, and then smaller, and now," she put her hand on the tin box, "now it's in here. It belongs to him and to who I was, and it doesn't crowd anything out anymore." She looked up. "I wanted you to know that." He looked at her for a long moment. "I know it," he said quietly. "I've watched it happen. I loved him. I know that too. And I love you," she said. "Both of those are true and neither one diminishes the other." He reached across and put his hand over hers where it rested on the box. "No," he agreed. "They don't." She turned her hand over and held on, the same gesture she had made on the porch that spring evening years ago, and the kitchen was warm around them, and outside the wind was beginning to pick up from the north, the first cold breath of another territory winter, and she thought about all the winters she had survived alone, and all the winters she would not survive alone now, and felt that the word survive had become the wrong word entirely. She was not surviving. She was living. There was a wide and irreducible difference. Jacob turned 16 in the spring of 1893 and began working the ranch in earnest, showing a talent for cattle work that made Cornelius proud in a way that was quiet and thorough, and Jacob knew it, and the knowledge sat between them as something neither needed to say aloud. Me was 12 and already showing signs of the particular combination of stubbornness and warmth that characterized her mother, and Thomas William was a bright, active 6-year-old, who had been named for a man he would never know but who seemed, in some indefinable way, to carry something of Thomas Norris's ease in the world. Harriet was 3 and entirely herself, which was a personality that could generously be described as extremely present. The ranch had grown in those years into something that Ella recognized as genuinely prosperous, not extravagant, not grand, but solid and self-sustaining, and built by two people's full effort together. She had her kitchen garden still, expanded now to supply a modest surplus she sold through Dora's mercantile, and she had the cattle alongside it, and she had her reputation in the county as a woman whose word was reliable and whose opinion was worth asking for. When the county organized itself further and began talking about a proper school, she was at the first meeting and left, having agreed to sit on the planning committee, because she had opinions about education that needed an appropriate outlet. Cornelius watched her at these meetings occasionally, and she caught him doing it, and his expression was always the same, steady and warm and full of the particular kind of pride that was not possessive, but was rooted in real knowledge of who the person was. She had come to recognize it as one of the most valuable things he gave her. Not support that required her to diminish herself, but support that required her to be fully herself, which was an entirely different thing. There was an afternoon in the summer of 1893 when she was in the kitchen making preserves, and he came in from the south pasture with mud on his boots and set them at the door and came to stand beside her and looked at the jars lined up on the counter with their bright rings of sealed color, red plum, amber peach, dark purple grape, and said, "When I rode past your fence that first morning, I didn't plan to mend it." She looked up from the jar she was sealing. "What?" "I saw it was broken when I came along the creek road. I had fencing supplies in the wagon. I stopped without planning to." He paused. "I was there for an hour before I had thought about it enough to decide it was the right thing to do. And then you did it anyway. And then I did it." She looked at him. He was watching the preserves jars with the expression of someone who is saying something that has been waiting a long time to be said. "I never knew whether it was presumptuous," he said. "I still don't entirely know. You had every right to be angry." "I wasn't angry," she said, which was mostly true. "I was unsettled. I know. Because I couldn't send it back." She turned to face him fully. "I couldn't undo the fact that you had done it. And I couldn't pretend I didn't need it done." She paused. "That was the thing that frightened me, not the fence, the needing." He looked at her with those steady brown eyes. "I know," he said. "I knew it then." "Then why didn't you stop?" "Because I thought," he considered his words carefully, the way he always did, unhurried. "I thought the needing was not the part to be afraid of. I thought what you were actually afraid of was the next part, what comes after needing." She knew what he meant. She had known it herself eventually. The part after needing was caring, and the part after caring was the risk. And the risk was the part she had sealed herself against as thoroughly as she was now sealing these jars, as though if she got the seal tight enough nothing could get in and nothing could get out, and she could hold everything intact against the entropy that had taken Thomas. "You were patient," she said. "You were worth it. Cornelius Hartwell," she said, and she said it the way she had said it on the first evening she had called him by his given name, just his name, nothing more, but carrying everything. He smiled, that slow smile that changed the whole landscape of his face, and she put down the jar she was holding and stepped to him, and he put his arms around her, and she leaned into him, and thought about the woman who had stood at the fence 3 years before his fence mending, and 3 years before the suppers and the potatoes and the porch and the creek in the summer light, the woman who had turned her face away from everything that might break her open. And she felt only a quiet gratitude for that woman because she had kept 2 children fed and a farm running and herself upright when upright was the only viable option. And she had eventually, when the time was right, turned toward, rather than away. The territory around them was changing. The land runs of 1889 had brought more settlers, and the towns were growing, and the old wildness of the territory was being pushed steadily toward its edges. There were fences now where there had been open range, and the faces at the church and the general store were new alongside the familiar, and the Cherokee and Cheyenne and the other nations whose land this had once been were further confined and further diminished, and the injustice of it did not grow smaller for being settled into the fabric of daily life. She and Cornelius talked about it as they talked about everything, directly and without comfort if comfort was not warranted. And she taught her children the history of the land they lived on, not to fill them with guilt that produced nothing useful, but to fill them with the knowledge that produced something, which was the understanding that the world was not arranged fairly, and that therefore the obligation fell on the individual to arrange their own small portion of it as fairly as they were capable of. Jacob, at 17, asked questions about this that she could not always answer, and she told him so, and she thought that not knowing the answer and being honest about it was one of the better things she could offer him. The winter of 1894 was the hardest in several years, the kind of winter that reminded everyone who had started to feel comfortable that the territory could still be formidable. Snow came in December and stayed, and temperatures dropped far enough that the creek froze solid for the first time in Ella's memory, and the cattle had to be hand-fed for weeks. It was relentless and demanding work, and there were days when she came in from the cold so tired that she sat down at the kitchen table before she took her coat off and felt the tiredness in her bones, the deep kind that makes you aware of every year you have spent on a particular kind of work. Cornelius was always there in those evenings, bringing her coffee, sitting beside her at the table without requiring anything from her. On the worst evenings he told her things he had noticed that day, a hawk he had seen above the south pasture, something funny Jacob had said, the way little Harriet had looked at the snow through the window as though she were planning to do something about it. He gave her, with these small offerings, the texture of the life around her when she was too tired to see it for herself, and she received them and was restored by them more than she would once have believed it possible to be restored by another person's noticing. The spring broke in March with a warmth that felt like an apology for February, and by April the land was green again, and the creek was running, and the kitchen garden was ready to be turned, and everything was beginning again in the particular circular way that lives on the land began again every year, not the same but continuous. She was standing at the window one morning in April watching the light come across the south pasture when he came up behind her and put his hands on her shoulders and looked out with her. The cattle were visible at the edge of the pasture, moving slowly through the new grass, and Jacob was out there somewhere, and beyond the fence was the creek and the tree line and the enormous Oklahoma sky doing what it did in April, which was to be more sky than seemed strictly necessary. "What are you thinking?" she asked him, and he made a sound that was the beginning of a laugh. "I was thinking," he said, "that I am the luckiest man in this county and possibly this territory." She looked at the pasture and felt the warmth of his hands on her shoulders and thought about luck and what it was. She had not felt lucky when Thomas died. She had not felt lucky the long first winter alone, or the second, or the third. She had felt like someone who had been handed something that could not be carried and had to carry it anyway. She had built the carrying into a kind of identity, and then had had to carefully, patiently, with a good deal of internal resistance, dismantle that identity enough to let someone else carry some of the weight. But standing here now, in this house that had been Thomas's and was now theirs, with her children distributed across the farm and the ranch they had built together, with the smell of spring coming through the gap in the window frame and his hands warm and steady on her shoulders, she thought that luck was maybe not the right word. Luck was something that happened to you. This was something they had made. Both of them together, out of patience and will, and the willingness to be changed by love when it came, even when the timing was not simple and the history was not uncomplicated and the fear was real. She put her hand over his where it rested on her shoulder. He turned his palm and held on. "I was thinking the same thing," she said. The county school opened in the fall of 1894 in a proper building with 2 rooms and a full-time teacher, which Ella had pushed for at every committee meeting for 2 years, and which she sat through the dedication of with a proprietary satisfaction she did not attempt to hide. Cornelius, sitting beside her at the dedication, leaned over and said quietly, 3 committee members told me this wouldn't happen without you." She looked at the building and said, "It wouldn't have." He made the sound that was his laugh. Little Harriet started school that fall and proved herself to be as opinionated in an educational setting as she was at home, which her teacher communicated to Ella through a series of notes of increasing diplomatic complexity, and which Ella and Cornelius found it necessary to discuss at the kitchen table with great seriousness of expression. And then, when the children were in bed, with considerably less. Thomas William, at 7, turned out to have a gift for mathematics that startled his teacher and delighted his mother and made Cornelius look at the boy with the particular expression of someone witnessing something they didn't know to expect. "He gets it from Thomas," Ella said one evening when Thomas William had gone to his room with a borrowed book of arithmetic problems he had requested. "Thomas could figure accounts faster than any man in the county." She paused. "I always thought it was a gift I didn't pass on." "You passed on other things," Cornelius said. "The stubbornness." "The stubbornness," he agreed, "and the gardening and the way of seeing a problem clearly before you decide what to do about it." She looked at him. "You've been thinking about what I passed on to them." "I've been watching you with them for 9 years," he said. "It's hard not to notice what they carry of you." She turned this over in the quiet for a moment. She thought about what her children carried of Thomas, of herself, of Cornelius, of the land and the years and the accumulation of ordinary days. She thought about how a life was made, not in the extraordinary moments but in the layering of the ordinary ones, and how you could not always see the pattern while you were in it. "I'm glad you stopped asking," she said. He looked at her. "What?" "The fence. When you stopped coming to the door and asking if I needed help and just did it." She paused. "I was never going to say yes to being helped. My whole self was organized around not saying yes to that. If you had kept asking, I would have kept saying no, and eventually you would have had to respect that and stop." She looked at him steadily. "But you couldn't do the same thing with a fence that you had done with a question. I couldn't refuse a fence that was already mended." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I wasn't sure it was the right thing to do." "It was," she said, "not because I needed the help, though I did, but because it was you being honest about what you wanted to do, regardless of whether I was going to allow it." She paused. "It was the most genuine thing anyone had done for me in a long time. It wasn't about what I would accept. It was just about what you knew needed doing and who you were." He looked at her for a long moment. "Ella," he said. "Cornelius," she said. And in the kitchen of the house on the Oklahoma territory, with the lamp burning low and the autumn dark settling over the land outside, and the children breathing quietly in their rooms, and the cattle settled in the expanded barn that Jacob had negotiated for at 7 years old, and the north fence standing straight and true with posts that had been replaced several times by now and would be replaced again. She leaned across the table and kissed him. And he kissed her back with the unhurried certainty of a man who had waited a long time for the right thing and had found it, and was not in any hurry to stop finding it. In the spring of 1896, Ella turned 40 years old, which she observed with characteristic practicality and characteristic feeling, mostly in private, at the window, watching the last of the morning frost melt off the fence posts, thinking about who she had been at 30 and 20, and wondering at the distance. Cornelius marked the occasion by arranging a dinner at the Clearwater Hotel, an actual hotel now, the town having grown sufficiently to support one with the family and the Finches and the Kramers from the East property. And she sat at the long table, surrounded by the noise and warmth of a life she had built and allowed herself to be built by. And she felt her age as a thing to be proud of rather than cautious about. Jacob was 18 that year, tall and quiet and deeply capable, and he had begun to show interest in the Kramer girl, the older one, Clara, who was 17 and sensible, and had her mother's good humor and her father's practical good sense. Ella watched this developing interest with the particular mixture of feelings a mother had watching her child move toward their own story, and she said nothing directly, but made sure Clara was at the table at any reasonable occasion, because she recognized a good person and did not believe in withholding opportunities from good people. Me was 15 and already talking about what she would do when she was grown in ways that suggested she had large ambitions that the territory might not fully contain. And Ella did not discourage this, but channeled it toward the school committee and the church groups and the various organs of community life that were available, because she believed in ambition finding its shape through use. Thomas William did his sums and read every book that came within range of him, and was kind to his sister Harriet, who remained formidable and required kindness, delivered with a certain amount of backbone. The baby Harriet, who was 6, had recently decided she wanted to learn to ride a horse, and Cornelius had been teaching her with the same patient thoroughness with which he did everything. And there was a particular Saturday morning in May of that year when Ella came out to the paddock fence and watched him lead the pony in slow circles with Harriet very upright in the saddle, with the look of someone who was concentrating with their whole body. And she leaned on the fence and felt the warmth of the spring sun on her face, and thought that this was what she had been so afraid of, not loss, which she had already survived, but this specific abundance, the thing that could be taken, the thing that made loss worth fearing because what you stood to lose was this good. She had been right to fear it. She had been wrong to make the fear the final word. He saw her at the fence and led the pony over, Harriet still upright and concentrating, and he looked at Ella with that steady, unhurried gaze, and she thought about the first time she had seen that gaze on her front porch and not known what to do with it, and she thought about every time since, and she thought about all the times still to come. "She's doing well," Ella said, nodding at Harriet. "She's doing exactly what she sets her mind to," Cornelius said, which could be said of the women in this family generally. Ella raised her eyebrows slightly. Was that a complaint? It was a compliment, he said with complete sincerity. She smiled and he smiled, and Harriet, noticing that she was not the subject of attention for a moment, made a clicking sound with her tongue and urged the pony forward without waiting for guidance, which was very Harriet indeed and also very much like her mother, and Cornelius turned back to follow her without quite losing the smile. Ella stayed at the fence for a while longer. She watched her husband and her daughter in the spring paddock, the morning light on the new grass and the sound of the pony's hooves on the soft ground, and she thought about the north fence and the man who had mended it without asking her permission, and about all the things she had been too afraid to want, and all the things she had eventually wanted anyway. And she thought that the territory had given her hard years and good ones and years that were both, and that she would not trade any of them, not even the winters alone, because they were the path that led here. She stayed at the fence until Cornelius brought the pony around again and caught her eye, and she pushed off from the rail and walked toward him across the spring grass, toward the ordinary, extraordinary, irreplaceable life they were building together out of patience and time and love and all the long seasons between. The north fence stood straight behind her. It would need mending again someday. Everything did. And when it did, she would not stand at the edge of the property alone, turning the problem over by herself in the cold morning air, pretending the need was not a need. She would walk back to the house and find him at the breakfast table or in the barn or out in the pasture, and she would say, "We have a fence that needs work," and he would say, "I'll get the tools," and they would fix it together, the way they did everything that mattered, the way they had been doing it since the beginning of all their best years.